So we all know, like we've seen, like, a lot of these new indie games coming out that have more like this old school kind of, graphic style, or like older, like pixel style art, or, just really low poly kind of games, akin to like something like you see on like SNES or PS1, whatever. Well, apparently there was one of the devs for like one of the early Final Fantasies had chimed in and made a comment about it. So, low poly graphics are alive and well in 2025. Excuse me. Despite their association with the limitations of consoles from over 20 years ago, today it is possible to make games that look almost photoreal, but titles like the survival horrors, were closed, and Crow Country have had success in a more retro look. Now, this is true. We have seen like this, a rise in like these more retro style kind of games, and they have been seeing success. So the low poly option is more economical than realism, and can tap into nostalgia. But one veteran developer who worked with the style out of necessity can't see why anyone would want to use it today as a stylistic choice. I don't think you want to love me. I am not that great. But his comments have reignited a big debate among gamers and developers alike. Square Enix programmer, oh, of course, it's Final Fantasy, worked on Final Fantasy X and Xenogears, writing on X in response to a post about shader graph to distort textures in in Unity. He expressed incomprehension to the retro revival. Something developers in the late 90s and early 2000s would futilely try to avoid is now seen as flavor. And see, again, this comes off as very, very boomerish, I think. And I don't know, it's the same thing as a lot of these developers now. I mean, if you worked on games back in the 90s, early 2000s, and, this was like the best of the best at the time, and, you had to put in painstaking hours to make it look like this, and then now you see people that can, create photorealism, and this is looked as something as with like current software and development and everything, and then you see stuff like this, and it's like, oh, well, I can produce this, within like a matter of like, a much shorter amount of time. A lot of your older developers are going to see that as, why would you ever want to do that? Why? It looks like crap now. Well, it might look like crap, but to a lot of people, it has like that nostalgic look to it. And I can kind of get that. I have like over the past few years, I have seen a lot of like pixel style kind of games, especially, that have been very good games. And I'm sure we can all think of at least one or two like indie games that are more, like older style, pixelated or low poly kind of games that were just genuinely fun, good games, and probably took a lot less effort to make. Now, that's not, saying that it's easy to make that kind of stuff, but, I can understand the appeal to want to make some kind of low poly or like, retro style kind of look for a game. It does have I guess the word I would use is it has its own form of like charm to it, in a sense. And a lot of people just really like it. But there's always going to be the people that, they look at it, they look back, and they realize all the hard work that it took them to do that, and they don't understand it at all. They don't even want to take the time to understand why somebody would want to make something like that. He even reposted an old tweet from 2019, which he described texture distortion on the original PlayStation was abhorrent. The idea of finding it interesting to reproduce doesn't occur to me. Again, this is coming from a mindset of, I put a lot of work and it was ridiculous amount of work. I would never want to do that again. It's a very one-sided kind of thing. They're looking at it from a development standpoint, not an actual consumer point of view. what does the consumer actually like? What do they want? What do they enjoy? That kind of thing. The comments have reopened a debate about the objective of graphics. It's true that the blocky characters and worlds produced by low poly graphics were seen as a frustration and limitation rather than an artistic choice at the time. There was a big gap between what developers would have liked to achieve and what was realistically possible. And this is true. Given current hardware and software improvements, we have reached a point to where there is, this broad spectrum of artistic style and artistic flair. Because, you see stuff you got stuff like, oh, God, what's the name of that stupid game? I can't remember it now. There was a game that was made. It was basically the guy said he made it with photo scans where he just drew something out and made photo scans of it. And I can't remember the name of the game. But that's one example. You got your pixel art style games. You've got your cell shaded kind of style. There's so many different forms of artistic style for a lot of these games that is just, you wouldn't have been able to do, 20, 30 years ago. Some people, or wait, did I lose track somewhere? I think I lost track. After Chi was, okay, yeah. Some people agree with Koji's take. I don't understand this desire either. I hated it as a kid and I hate it now. There's nothing charming about it. Again, it's an opinion. Everybody's entitled to their opinion. I get it. Some people, even when they were kids, they thought, that these low poly kind of games, they just look like shit, and they wanted something more realistic even when they were a kid. So I understand it. But at the same time, I can look back at it and I can say, well, it's really not that bad. FF7's kind of it's a bad example to use for low poly kind of games that actually had their own kind of charm, because even back then it looked ridiculous. I'll be honest. But there are other, great examples of, low poly kind of games. You've got I guess a good example for me would be more like Parasite Eve, or, some of your old platformers like Gex or Crash Bandicoot, that kind of stuff. So there were games that were more charming to look at than something like this. But yeah. But Koji's view is also underestimates the emotional pull of nostalgia, which is very true. That's why Mario has not changed substantially, and it's, how God knows how many years it's been around. It's similar to what happened with pixel art. Efforts made in the past to handle the limitations of a medium are now considered an art style, and that does have a charm for some people because it reminds them of the games they loved when they were younger, and that is true. So a lot of this, it does harken back to the nostalgia trip from it. You saw it with the perspective of the artist upset that their work isn't perfect. This desire for PS1 style art comes from players who grew up and enjoyed the style, and that is true. Again, it all comes back to that. It looks cool and has a personality, unlike a lot of games today, which I do agree with. A lot of games, they try to force this, photorealism so hard that it kind of loses any sense of originality, and it just tries to emulate other games that look similar. Low poly graphic also requires more imagination on the player's part, and then there's the cost factor. The expense of creating 3D realism in Unreal outstrips many times the cost of using low poly, and some players would prefer regular releases over waiting 10 years for the next game in a franchise, which I understand that some people do want their annual kind of games, like your Call of Duties and Assassin's Creed, that kind of shit. But there are still a large amount of people that wouldn't mind having to wait, several years, between game releases. And it's very true. I know plenty of people that would be completely content with waiting, 3, 4, sometimes even 5 years or whatever, in between game releases, just as long as it's, a little more polished, a little more put together. For retro game art, for retro game art applied to a very different medium. Check out this artist, blah, 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 for inspiration for your own game. CR, but okay, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, that's it. But yeah, no, I think that a lot of these like low poly and pixel art kind of games, they do have like their own, art style, I guess if you want to call it, but they do have like a unique charm to them. And so to just sit here and tell people like, well, why would you want to do that when you can make things look realistic? Well, yes, that's true, but if you want your game to stand out and you want it to be unique, and you're not really prioritizing photorealism over the actual game itself and just making the game fun, what does it really matter? Oh shit, hit a button, sorry. But yeah, so what does it really matter? Like, at the end of the day, we play games because they're fun to play. If I wanted to watch 60, 70 hours worth of cutscenes, then, obviously I'm just going to go watch a TV show if that's really what I'm into. Now, I do know that there are plenty of games that are, cinematic, that are full of cutscenes, your typical like RPGs, especially like a lot of the older RPGs like PS1, PS2 era had a lot of cutscenes and they were good. But then again, the story was also good and it was engaging and I actually cared about it, but that's not so relevant anymore because a lot of them are just shit. But I digress. So yeah, no, I think seeing a rise in low poly and pixel art kind of games, I think it's great. Like, I would love to continue to see it. I think it'd be kind of cool to see even more games go with this low poly style. I look back at games like Parasite Eve, Crash Bandicoot, Gex, and some of those kind of games like on PS1, which it doesn't necessarily have to be like block like FF7 or anything like that, but just low poly. I think it has its own type of charm and demeanor to it, and it does. I think it has more of like more of an art style choice than anything else. And if people want to. I don't really know if there's like extra effort nowadays that has to be put into making, these low poly games. I know jack shit about game development or anything like this. So I don't know if there's more or less effort that has to go into it. But overall, I think the fact that person, took the time to, make their game look like that and wants to give it a certain feel, then I think it does show a little bit of, it shows more creativity than just trying to do the same thing all these other AAA companies do, which is just go for photorealism. But at the same time, gameplay is king, and that's why we play games, is for the gameplay. I mean, I personally think that the graphical style or graphical look of a game is just the cherry on top, pretty much. But I don't know. That's my opinion. I don't really think it's too crazy of a thought.